Hello, everyone. I'm Randy Pargman,
And I'm Jean-Francois Maes.
and we're going to be talking to you about our research and development efforts around red teams attacking logs and blue teams defending against them and trying to bust the ghost in the logs.
Yeah, I thought this was very awesome. And I think it all started when we presented both at Unicon. We started talking to each other, and I was under the premise that I wanted to see from a red team's perspective what was going on if like all the worst things could happen to a blue team. And I wanted to know Randy, because Randy's pretty good at his job. Wanted to know his opinion about how you could potentially defend against that. And you're gonna see what we're talking about in just a minute.
Let's introduce ourselves just a little bit. I work at Binary Defense, where I work in threat hunting for a lot of different clients, trying to find new advanced ways to detect the attackers and all the techniques that they use. And prior to working at Binary Defense, where I've been for the last 2 years, I worked for 15 years at the FBI, where I worked on cybercrime investigations and digital forensics incident response.
Following that up, that's quite some big shoes to fill there. So my name is Jean-Francois Maes. I work at Trusted Sec, and I'm also a SANS instructor. I teach the 699 course there. I create open source tools, primarily red team based. And I'm also the creator of redteamer.tips, which is a help website for red teams with some field notes, just a quick cheat sheet there if you want, if you're stuck somewhere and you want some help. Feel free to take a look at that as well. So there you go. As I already mentioned, the preface of this is actually how adversaries can mess with defenses and how defenders could potentially react to this if a worst case scenario would hit. And what do I mean by that? Well, we all know the saying that defenders have the home field advantage. It's something that has been said over and over again, but is this really true though? Because defenders do have the home advantage. They do know their environment. They know which servers are there. They know which defenses they have. But adversaries also know about the common technologies that tend to get them caught, such as EDRs, such as Sysmon, such as log forwarding to seams. So those things are very, very similar in almost all environments. Adversaries know this stuff, so they can start tampering with this stuff as well. And defenders, however, are actually fighting the unknown. Yes, they do know their own environment, but they don't know what's going to hit them. There are a billion threat actors out there with a lot of TTPs. Most of them, or at least some of them, are mapped on the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but there are definitely nation states TTPs out there that don't have a mapping just yet. And to illustrate this even further, there are over 87 different C2 frameworks actually logged on the C2 matrix, which is actually a website that is dedicated to try and map all the different C2s out there. So there are over 87 different C2s out there. And as you can imagine, yes, they share similarities, but they also have their own nuances as well. And as I already mentioned, various threat actors, each with their own TTPs. So on what do these tools rely, right? So EDRs, they can rely on user mode hooks, and they also have kernel callbacks. Sysmon typically relies on ETW events, which stands for Event Tracing for Windows. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. And the event log service. And then, of course, the log forwarders. And what do they rely on? Well, they rely on actually having reachability to the target they are forwarding the logs to. So what are user mode hooks? If you haven't heard about this before, allow me to quickly illustrate what we're actually talking about here. So typically what we can see is every process that is running in your computer at one point or another calls ntdll.dll, which is the gap between user mode and kernel mode. So as you may know, the operating system has a kernel. That's actually the thing that is responsible of running the entire operating system and running the processes on there. And the processes that are running in your operating system need to have a way to interact with each other, of course. And that is what the kernel is responsible for. So NTDLL is actually the bridge between the two. And you can recognize NTDLL functions because it's typically annotated with NT. For example, NT virtual protect, NT allocate virtual memory. So all NT functions belong to NTDLL.dll. And all modules at one point or another will call NTDLL.dll. So this is a primary example for EDRs to actually inspect, right? This is interesting traffic because everything goes through this and they want to inspect what is going on. So what typically happens is, as you can see in the first top of this slide, this is actually an example of a disassembled code of NT-allocate virtual memory. And this is how it typically looks like. So it does some move instructions, it does a compare instruction, it does a syscall, and it does a return. Now, on the bottom half of the slide, you can actually see what a hooked function looks like. And you can see this is actually quite different because here the first instruction is a move instruction, and here the first instruction is a jump instruction to a different memory address. And if you would follow this memory address, 99% out of 100, you will end up into another DLL, which most likely will be the DLL of the EDR that is trying to inspect your traffic. So what can you do as an adversary? Well, it's actually very simple. What can you do as an adversary? You can try and subvert that because you know that NT functions are actually always following the same instructions. There's always a move instruction. There's always a compare instruction. There's always a syscall instruction. You can actually craft your own function and call that instead and try to evade hooks that way. But we will get into that in just a second. Let's talk about the event log service and ETW first. So the event log service relies on ETW, and ETW stands for event tracing for Windows. Now, what does this actually mean? Here I am once again talking about kernel. It's actually a tracing function that belongs to the Windows kernel. It exposes different providers where processes can subscribe to. Some of these providers are very interesting from an EDR perspective, once again, such as, for example, the kernel provider, as it can actually give you information on when a process is being launched and also even threats. So when a threat is being launched, and this is very interesting because then you can actually correlate threats that are being spawned in a process and try to hunt for process injection, for example. So if one process is injecting a threat into another process, you will see that a new threat is being spawned from a process that is not the same process as that threat is running on. So that's very interesting. And a cool open source tool that allows you to play with this stuff is Silk ETW by Ruben Bonen, aka FuzzySec. Really cool open source developer as well. It's a really smart researcher. And this Silk ETW allows you to either log ETW events to the console, and it even has capabilities to actually log forward it to a Logstash, for example, or to a Splunk. So that's a really cool thing. If you're interested in learning more about ETW and their providers, I highly recommend you to use this middleware if you want to. So there you go. Then line of sight with a seam. I guess this is no surprise to anyone. Your endpoints collect logs. If you want to forward those logs, you'll have to have some kind of process that is actually collecting all the logs your endpoint has and ships them to another target. And of course, it relies on line of sight. If you can't communicate with the end target of your log forwarding, then the logs will never arrive there. So that's interesting to know as well, because we're going to dive into that in just a bit. So as I already mentioned multiple times, here we are not just assuming breach, we are actually assuming worst case scenario. So this research was conducted from a very simple idea. What if an adversary completely blinds you? So what if he can bypass really all the security measures that are in place in order to try and prevent an attacker from actually doing malicious stuff? What happens then? And I created some software. It's called Purple Power, and I'll link to it in the Discord as well, like the GitHub link to the project, so you can check it out if you're interested in the code. And what does Purple Power actually do? Well, it's actually capable of bypassing ETW and bypassing AMSI. AMSI is the malware scanning interface of Windows, so it bypasses those two things. It's written in C# and it's leveraging the deinvoke framework for syscall generation. So it actually bypasses the user mode hooks. Again, I'll talk more about that in just a second. It can nuke the event log. It can also load a malicious driver in order to completely stop ETW events from being written in the first place. Or it can inject into the event log service and use Jara rules in order to make smart decisions whether or not you want to log an event or you want it to be blocked. And finally, but not less important, it can sinkhole communications to seams. So bypassing user mode hooks, as I already mentioned, hooks are things that EDRs, for example, like to place on things. So how does that work? You're a regular user, you're spawning a process, that process needs to communicate with NTDLL, and an EDR will hook that NTDLL page for you. Now, I am malware now, and I want to create some malicious stuff. I want to do some malicious stuff. Well, guess what? I too want to communicate with the operating system. So I too need to communicate with ntdll.tll, which is hooked. So my malware is going to call an nt instruction that is actually hooked by the EDR. So the EDR will see my call to the ntdll function. It will inspect it and it will do some processing logic, whether or not to decide if I'm malicious or not. If the EDR deems that indeed my call is malicious, it's going to block and it's going to send an alert, or if not, it's going to let me pass. Now, how can you evade that? Well, as I already mentioned, NT functions always follow the same kind of assembly instructions. It's always going to do a compare, it's always going to do a syscall, it's always going to do a return. So we know this. We can actually know the function prototypes of this stuff, even though it's undocumented. There's actually a lot of research already out there. There are entire websites dedicated to undocumented function of Microsoft. So if you want the function prototype in assembly, you'll definitely be able to find it. And deinvoke or dynamic invocation is a C# framework that actually automates this process for you, so you don't have to do it. And what does it look like? Well, again, you are a user, you're spawning a process. That process needs ntdll.tll, so it's going to load it into its process memory. That is still going to get hooked, but now I'm going to do something different from a malware perspective. I'm not simply going to call the ntdll.tll function anymore. I'm actually going to ask a clean ntdll.tll file from disk. So I'm actually going to manually map a new ntdll.tll into the process memory, which will not be hooked, as EDRs typically place their hook on process start, and the process is already started, so the ntdll.tll page is already hooked. I'm going to just simply map a new ntdll.tll in memory, and I'm going to call the nt function from that newly mapped ntdll.tll instead, which is not hooked and which will not trigger any alerts. So happy days for adversaries. So ETW shenanigans. I already said that Purple Power actually has 3 different ways of messing with ETW. The first one is actually just simply nuking the entire ETW log service. So that's actually the most impactful, because I'm just simply nuking the entire thing. It's also the loudest. So what does that look like? Well, you may or may not know that event log service is actually running as a privileged process on your system, which is just svchost.exe. There are a lot of SVC hosts in there, but you can actually use WMI to query the exact process ID that is hosting the event log service. So as you can see here on the slide, I'm basically saying, look, I want all the services, but I want to filter on event log, and I want the process ID of that. So here I see that the process ID is 2056. And if I use process hacker and look for 2056, I see svchost.exe. If I inspect the threads in this svchost.exe, I will see wevtsvc.dll, which is actually the DLL responsible for the event log. So what I do is I'm actually going to suspend all the threads that are running event log. And this is actually a snippet that is used from ired.team, which is another red teamer website out there. And you can see here the threads are being suspended. And here you can see that the first command is actually being logged, so audit success. But the second command, it's not being logged. Nothing happens. And that is because the threads are suspended. So nothing can be logged as there's nothing to log anymore. There's nothing that can actually do the logging anymore. It's suspended in place. So that's really interesting. That's the first bypass. Another bypass is actually made by Batsec. Actually, the next two bypasses are made by Batsec. He's a very smart researcher as well, offensive tradecraft, and he's actually very young. I think by the time of this presentation, he's 19 or 20 years old. So it's really amazing, really smart guy, really young as well. And what he found out is he used WinDBG, which is a Windows debugger in kernel mode. And he actually started disassembling functions. And he found that there's actually an NT function called NT-trace-event, event tracing for Windows, ETW. So the correlation is not that hard to make. This event, this function is also responsible, but from kernel level, for ETW event writes. So what happens here is he actually patched it in memory with a very simple return statement. And what he found is once it immediately returns, the event log is not writing anything again. Now, this is a kernel function, and this is not something you can typically manipulate from user land, as there is protections in place that a user, even if you're local admin, can't just simply start messing around with the kernel. That's just simply not possible. So a vulnerable kernel actually needs to be loaded in memory, and there are a ton of them. Sorry to say, but there are multiple vulnerable drivers out there that are signed. Even Intel has a vulnerable driver out there as well. So there's a project on GitHub called KDU, which is actually a collection of vulnerable drivers, and it allows you to sideload your own driver, which is unsigned, which is typically not possible, but because you're exploiting another vulnerable signed driver that has kernel read-write privileges, you are allowed to sideload an unsigned driver, and that unsigned driver is called Ghost in the Logs. And Ghost in the Logs will simply patch the NT-trace event function, and it will immediately return. So that means every time the function is called, it's going to return. So it's not going to do anything. It's just going to say, okay, I did something, but in reality, it actually didn't do anything. And that also bypasses the event log, as you will see here in just a moment. So once again, here you can see event log actually running. And there's going to be a PowerShell prompt in just a minute. Just give it a second. The PowerShell window spawns. And normally you would suspect that a process ID 1 will be registered in sysmon. Process ID 1 is process create, but in reality, there's nothing there. Why not? Because Ghost in the Logs patched that function and simply didn't write anything to the sysmon event log. And then the third one is actually the sneakiest one, in my opinion, and Randy from the blue side will definitely agree with me there. This one isn't simply nuking anything. It's also not simply patching all of the functions. This is actually a very, very sneaky thing Batsa came up with, and he actually used Jara, which is typically a blue teamer's tool, but he uses it offensively. So what ETW event mute does is it's going to inject a new thread into that SVC host that is running the event log, and it's going to just simply listen for new events. If an event is actually hitting that event log service and it matches a Jara rule, it's going to drop it. So it's going to do that return. It's going to drop it. It's not going to log anything. If it doesn't match the Jara rule, however, it's simply going to keep writing. So it's only going to take very, very specific attacks based on Jara rules, and it's going to make decisions based on that. If it's going to get hit, it will discard it. If it's not getting hit, the event log will just resume as normal, which is very, very tricky for a defender to defend against. So sinkholing communications to the seam, that one is actually very, very straightforward, because here I'm actually cheating a little bit. I know that Sentinel is being used in our environment as a theme, and it's well documented by Microsoft. There's actually a command line that you can use, a PowerShell script, to enroll yourself into Sentinel. And here you can clearly see that health service is being used for this. Now, if you're familiar with sysinternal tools, you know that sysinternals actually has a TCP view package that you can run in order for you to see every process that is running on your system and whether or not they are creating a connection to the internet. So here you can see health service. And my first train of thought was, I'm just going to blacklist a specific IP in the firewall. But then if you look at this screenshot, you'll actually see it's not just the 227, but also the 228 that is being contacted by health service. So then I was thinking, okay, I can just blacklist these two IPs. But then I started talking to Randy, and Randy actually linked me Microsoft documentation again of all the IPs that Azure are using, and there are a ton of them. And I didn't want to go through the hassle of actually creating blacklist rules for all those IPs, because not all those IPs are just Sentinel. There could actually be other services running in Azure that you still want to communicate to. So instead of using IPs, I just went for a very, very dirty approach, and I just blacklisted the entire binary. And how did I do that? Well, there are actually two approaches that you can take. You can either use the netshell command, so that's a utility that is living in every Windows operating system. Using the ADV firewall command, you can actually manipulate the local firewall. So you can add a rule based, for example, on a binary, or you could also do it in C++, you could also do it in C#. And if you want to use C#, there's actually a very nice package already available to you. There's a binary, a library to use. And it's very, very simple. In just a few lines of code, as you can see here, you can blacklist whatever you want, honestly. So that is what I did. I created a new rule, see a nerds, and you can give it an arbitrary binary to blacklist. And in this case, we're obviously targeting that healthservice.exe. So this is some nice ASCII art, because no tool is complete without ASCII. Purple Power, it's available on GitHub as well. As I already mentioned, I'm going to drop it in the Discord, the link, if you're interested in checking out that code. But without further ado, let's just do a very, very short live demonstration so you can actually see it in action. And in order to do that, I need to go into my remote desktop. I will need to sign into my domain admin account. Don't do this, by the way, in production. Don't just log in as a domain admin everywhere. I don't want to stay up to date. I'm sorry, this is an outdated operating system by design. So here we have the Purple Power, the help menu. Oh, it's a bit messed up. Sorry about that. So I have nuke, I have mute, I have ghost in the logs, I have backdoor, I even have Cobalt Strike, which will inject a predefined Cobalt Strike beacon. So don't use this if you're pulling the code from GitHub, because chances are that that Cobalt Strike instance is down. But in the off chance that it's up, you're giving me a free beacon on your system. So don't run the Cobalt command unless you modify it yourself with new shellcode. But yeah, without further ado, let's just, for example, nuke the event log, and let's add a backdoor to our system. So what it's going to do, it's going to patch OMSI, it's going to patch ETW, then it's going to reflectively load a other C# binary, which is called sharp event log nuker, something I created. Some nice ASCII there again. Here we can see that the nuke actually found the SVC host process with process ID 1596. It suspends all these threads. It nuked it successfully. It created a new invisible backdoor using sharp invisible backdoor, which is another binary I wrote. Once again, some nice ASCII art there. And it's actually a $ user with password backdoor123, which was successfully created and added to the admin group. Obviously, all this stuff relies on local admin privileges. So this purple power binary needs to be ran as a local admin. If it's not local admin, you won't be able to manipulate the event log service. And we can actually, I haven't checked this prior to the demo, so I hope it worked, but let's just verify whether or not it works using Process Hacker. So 1596 SVC host. Oh yeah, that's not going to work. I need to use Process Hacker as local admin as well. Sorry about that. Come on. Give me my keyboards. Okay, it doesn't, but it's in the recent, so it doesn't really matter. All right, there you go. 1596, that's SVC host. There we go. And I hope if we check the threads, yep, there you go. The threads are indeed all suspended. All the threads to that DLL that is responsible for the event log. So there you go, proof that it works. Hey, very nice. So that's a demo of Purple Power. Obviously, you could use Ghost in the logs as well, or Mute if you want to. Feel free to check that out. If you don't believe me that it works. I need to start the presentation again. There you go. So that was the demo. And now I'm going to give the word to my esteemed colleague, Randy, for his side. So he's going to talk about the blue perspective here. Randy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jean-Francois. I really enjoyed working on this project with you. And I think everyone in the audience seeing this so far, if they're on the red team side, is probably already excited and maybe already downloading your GitHub so that they can start messing with this. Everybody on the blue team side is probably freaking out, like, oh my gosh, what is going to happen if somebody uses these tools? There's so many different ways to bypass my logs, to hide things from the EDR. What am I going to do? And the approach that I'd like to recommend is that in any case, when you're looking at red team tactics, think about these worst case scenarios. And instead of just getting stuck, think about what you could do. What can you do if you can't trust your logs? That's not to say that you want to give up logging, like, oh, it's no good, because most of the time that's exactly what you need to catch most of the threats. So we're not going to give up logging, but we are going to add an additional approach. And when you're thinking about an adversary blocking your logs, you want to start looking for what you cannot see, or looking for what's not there. There's actually a really great story from many years ago in computer security history that Cliff Stoll wrote about in the book, The Cuckoo's Egg. I don't know if you've read that before, but if you haven't, I really recommend it. It's a great story about how a system administrator at UC Berkeley caught a very advanced Russian state-sponsored hacker who was going after military secrets because he noticed that there was an difference. There was an unexplained difference between the logging time that the Unix computers reported that they were being used and another system that was keeping track of administration of amount of computer time that different users had used for billing purposes. Noticing the difference between those two logs told him that there was something happening that was not being recorded the way that it should be. So as we were approaching, this idea of how would you spot somebody who is a ghost in your own logs, I thought of really the same sort of approach. What if you had a different system, something that the attacker did not know about, that was auditing the use of the system in another way? Now, the most straightforward approach would be just have a second SIM that has log forwarding going to it, maybe some secondary logging. But there's a couple of problems with that. One is the attacker is probably going to see that as well. If they're going after your logs, they're probably going to see it if it's too much the same as what you already have. And whatever method they use to block that probably will be used to block your secondary system as well. So that's really out. But the second reason you wouldn't want to do that is purely economical. If you're going to take a second copy of all of your logs, you're probably paying double for whatever service you're paying for in the first place. And nobody on a security team wants to get a request, hey, could I double my budget for next year just as a backup, right? You don't want to be doing that. So again, I decided that the right approach to solving this problem would be to develop some new software. And I will also drop a link to the GitHub project where you can download the software for the blue team side. For fun, because we were talking about battling ghosts in the logs, we decided to use a Ghostbusters theme, and the software is called Vinkman. There's all kinds of references to Ghostbusters in here that I recommend if you're going to use this software in your environment, you change all of these things, because after attackers have viewed this presentation, you don't want them looking for Vinkman on your systems. So let's talk about the goals that we had. We want to detect if the log collection network traffic is cut off, if your log collector is no longer receiving events. You also want to detect if locally logs have gone down. And then stretch goals, if we could, we wanted to see if we could detect that really, really sneaky situation from BatSec software, if the event logs are just being filtered, if most of them are going through, but just some of them aren't. That's really hard. And then the last goal that we have is hide Vinkman so that the attacker doesn't see what's going on. Don't get caught, otherwise your backup system is going to just become a liability as well. So Vinkman is also designed in C# using .NET. It uses event tracing for Windows, ETW. And I implemented this as a DLL because one of the things we wanted to be able to do to hide Vinkman from the adversary is to actually use a red team technique and inject the DLL into some other process that you wouldn't think to look into. There are some requirements for that process. It does need to be running not as the local admin, but it does need to be running with a group that has permissions for subscribing to ETW events. And I'll link to some Microsoft documentation about what local group you can set up and what the permissions need to be. Vinkman needs to, and in fact it does with the implementation that we came up with, check the running processes on a regular basis. You also have the opportunity when you've got the running processes to check all of the threads that are in there. This is not something that I've implemented yet, but it's a future design to do some basic checks to see what are the threads in each of these processes, and is there something going on that maybe we might want to alert specially on. Then going through each of those processes, we want to count the number of events coming through ETW for each one of them. We're not going to log all the details of those events though. This is the trick to try to save us some money and save us some resources. We're just reporting on how many events of each type for each process we're seeing. Then we need to send those logs not to the log collector. We don't want to send them to the same place that is being blocked by the adversary, perhaps. We want to send them to some place inside of our network that the adversary is not going to want to block communication to. So in our test lab, we just sent them to a file server that was on the domain controller. So if their adversary is blocking traffic between the workstation and the domain controller, they're causing themselves as many problems as they're causing everyone else, and they're going to get caught right away. So we wanted to send the log someplace that wouldn't be so obvious and wouldn't get blocked. One of the things that we also wanted to do with this is to be able to change the configuration on the fly, like where are you sending the logs, which ETW events are you subscribing to? And so I implemented that using DNS. DNS has a lot of different record types. One of them that is very convenient for red teams and blue teams both is the TXT record type. You get just like 4 kilobytes of text that you can respond to DNS queries with. And so we use internal Active Directory DNS TXT records to tell the Vinkman client where to send the logs and which ETW subscribers to to hook up to. And then every 60 seconds, it checks in with those again. And if they've changed, if you've made a change as the administrator, all of the Vinkman clients across your enterprise will get the change within the next minute or so, change the config on the fly. And then anything with Ghostbusters themes needs a PKE meter or an horoscope. So we use that just as far as naming conventions, but we had a lot of fun with this. So we've really already talked about what ETW is. So I won't go into that a whole lot, but I just wanted to show you a couple of the DNS TXT records that we use. So the DNS name that I chose for this is Vinkman-ETW-providers. And then whatever your local domain name is, you definitely want to change that so that the adversaries aren't looking for Vinkman in DNS records. But you can change that just with a config in the software very easily. And then as the value for the TXT, you simply put the names of the ETW providers you want separated with a pipe character. So that's it. You can change that on the fly and all the Vinkman clients will be updated. Next, I thought really hard about what log format we wanted to use for this, because obviously we need to report all of these details. At first, I thought we wanted to use JSON as a format just because it's easy to parse, it's very standard. The problem is then that repeats the names of the columns throughout every single record. And it ends up being very heavy as far as the logs. And if you're paying per gigabyte of logs ingested, you definitely want to keep your logs as lightweight as possible. So what I did instead was use like a CSV format with a pipe character as the delimiter. And then every so often, when the column names were updated, I would just repeat out into the logs a new column header. And this worked out very well, ingesting these logs into Azure Sentinel, which is what we used for all of the analysis. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at what actually happened. Here's what these charts represent. We ran queries for time intervals of every 2 minutes and looked at in each of those 2-minute time intervals, how many sysmon events did we get? How many security events did we get from the endpoint that was under attack? And then we looked at the same time scale, what were we getting from Vinkman? And the charts that you're going to see are the number of processes that Vinkman recorded. I'll show you at the end the difference between the processes and the number of ETW events, which got more complicated. But this actually is the simpler way to do it. And the research showed this is probably the easiest way to do it that is also the most effective. So you can see at 10:33 UTC time, Jean-Francois attacking the system ran the event log nuker using sharp event log nukes. You can speak to this if you'd like, and also blocked the firewall, used a firewall rule to block the log collection. And you can see it absolutely worked. Like there's a big blank space in this time when there were no security events and there were no sysmon events. And then at 10:57, the machine was rebooted, Vinkman was restarted, the firewall rule block was removed. We do have some more research to do because we found that there were some logs that slipped in at a time when we didn't think that there should be. We've got some theories about this, that maybe there were some logs that kind of got queued up somehow, and then they got forwarded to the SIM later on after the system came back up. But we're definitely looking into that. It also could be that our clocks were not quite synchronized and we just noted the time a little bit wrong. But the good thing to notice here is that while the security logs and the sysmon events were not being recorded at all by the SIM, Vinkman still was. It had an alternate path. It wasn't being blocked. It was recording a different way. And so we have this opportunity as the defender to see that something is not right, because there is a difference between the accounting system, Vinkman, and our logging system in the SIM that is showing us there's no security and no sysmon, but we can see that there are events and there are processes running from this machine and it's still on. Next slide, please. This is using the next technique for Purple Power, which was Ghost in the Logs from BATSEC. And you can see this also worked really well. I'm going to show on the next slide how we're still getting security events, which is interesting. We weren't expecting to see that, but it did block sysmon events very well. Again, we see that there were a few events that happened a little bit earlier than we expected them to come back. So we need to look at that. But that big spike in sysmon events, that is the system reboot right there. So I think it very well might be that the clocks between Sentinel in Azure and our local clocks might not have been quite in sync. But you can also see during this ghost in the logs, Vinkman saw all of the events just fine. It still saw the processes running, and it was still reporting in this whole time that the logs were off. Next slide. I wanted to show, this is the same experiment as the last slide, but instead of sysmon events, we're looking at security events. And you can see that those didn't go away the whole time. So while Ghost in the Logs was running, the security events did not get blocked. And that's also going to require some more research, but this is good information for blue teams to know. Sometimes the tools that red teams use don't work the way that they expect them to. Maybe they're working just fine, but the thing that you think that they're going to do, they don't quite do all of those things. So it is useful to have multiple event sources that you're monitoring and multiple ways that you're looking at the logs. Next slide. This is the last experiment. This is using event mute and the firewall block at the same time. And again, you can see the same pattern that both the sysmon and the security logs did not come through to the SIM during this time period. We did have another unexplained little spike of events come through right at 1 p.m. and then they went away again. And then you can see the big spike when the system was rebooted. So once again, we'll be looking at that. But the great news is that Vinkman kept reporting in the entire time and could see all of these events. Next slide.
I think this spike, sorry to interrupt there, I think that spike is an update of a Java rule. So then it actually starts the, it's going to allow some events back again based on the Java rule, whether or not it gets hit or not. So I think that's the explanation for this one at least.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think out of all of these different attacks, that last one was definitely the sneakiest because you can see we're relying on the logs from sysmon and security going away while we can still see logs from Vinkman to be our indicator that something is wrong. So if there are still event logs happening, if there's still sysmon, there's still security, that would be very difficult for defenders to detect. I wanted to show you what a baseline of normal looks like. This is a period of 24 hours when no attacks at all were happening. And we can see in the green, that is the number of ETW events that Vinkman was recording. And in the purple squiggly line, you can see the number of processes that Vinkman was seeing. These are in two different scales. Otherwise, the number of process counts would just disappear on the x-axis. So the green events, the number of event counts is scale on the left, and the purple one, the number of processes, is on the right. This is for 5-minute intervals. And the important thing to take from this is that normally when a system is just running normally and there is no attack going on, you can expect that the number of processes is going to stay within a fairly expected range. It's kind of going to be bounded when you look at it in 5-minute intervals. And then the number of ETW events is going to vary wildly. Like it's all over the place. There's these huge spikes that happen at different times. And that's just because sometimes the system is incredibly more busy. There's Windows updates, there's reboots. Some processes, when they run, just create a massive number of events. So one of the things we were kind of hoping is that we'd be able to come up with like a best fit line on number of events and detect anomalies that way. But this sort of pattern makes that very, very challenging to do. Next slide. This is just for the period of time that we looked at for those 3 experiments when purple power was being used on this machine. And you can see, once again, there's some wild variation in the number of events, but the number of processes stays within a fairly bounded range and is none at no time do either one of these things go to 0. The closest thing to 0 that looked to me like it might be there was in the number of ETW events, and still that was like 4,500. Next slide.
There's also a nice homage to Botsec there. There's like the Batman kind of thing.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even see the bat ears. That is awesome. And it's purple. That works out well. So I wanted to show this is a very simple query in Kuso query language, KQL, that I set up as an alarm to tell me if across the environment there are any hosts for which in the last 5 minutes we're seeing events from Vinkman, but we're not seeing anything from the event logs. If that ever happens, then it raises an alarm and notifies me, and I say, oh, okay, here's a machine that I need to look at a little bit more closely, and then maybe I can use my remote IR tools to pull memory from it, or do some IR tasks to preserve what's going on that machine, so that I can tell the truth, what is really going on, rather than what I'm seeing through the event logs. So now we have time for questions, and we will be happy to take your questions in the Discord. Thank you very much.